first, those directories were actually other files. So it takes a little bit of time to acclimate to all the stuff that's in here. What we did with the README files is pretty much do ... for anything that's not interesting to look at yet. So realize that you can focus your attention only on these things. And in answer to your question, routes.php contains some of the magic with which we can do this mapping of URLs to actual methods. So let's take a look. This was the end result, recall. So we have the lectures page. I click lecture 0, and then I have these dynamically generated links to a PDF and to a video. So how did this actually work? Well, let me go back to the code, and let me go into last week's application directory. Let me go into my controllers directory. And we had just one file here. So there's two different controllers at play here. There's index.php, which came with the framework, and whose sole purpose in life is to route requests to controllers you actually wrote. So homepage.php is just an arbitrary name I came up with. It is in the controllers directory, and this is where I actually implemented the logic, the business logic of my program. So there's nothing aesthetic in here per se, but it does invoke the thing called the view. So how did I go about creating this controller? So the means by which CodeIgniter and a lot of these frameworks work is they give you some base classes. So recall object-oriented programming, where you can have a base class from which other things descend. And we'll come back to this before long. But for now, you can just take it, just assume that you must start any such controller with class homepage extends CI_controller. Kind of a stupid name, but that just means you get a bunch of functionality for free. What is the functionality you get for free? Well, because you are extending this CI controller class, and by that I mean there is a class that the CodeIgniter folks made that is called CI controller. And just conceptually, what you're doing is you're saying, I am now going to implement a class that's called homepage that contains every one of the methods and every one of the data fields as this class, but I might want to add my own, and I also might want to override some of the things in the parent class. So among the features I get for free by extending that class is this feature of index. So CodeIgniter assumes that if you implement a method called index, that is the method that's going to get invoked automatically if the URL visits if the user visits a URL of the form /homepage with no bar or baz. So just the name of the controller. Index will get invoked. Meanwhile, if you visit /homepage/lectures or homepage/lecture, notice that I'm calling each of these methods instead. So what do each of these methods do? They're almost all identical. So they're definitely following a pattern here. But on the very first line of index, the very first thing I do, recall, is I invoke my header. So the header is a view. It's sort of a partial view. And recall the header contained what? Like the fluffy stuff like open bracket HTML, body, head, and all of that stuff that we previously implemented manually ourselves. The footer contained the boring stuff like the close body tag and the close HTML tag. And then what is meant to be in this second view? Yeah?
The actual relevant view for the
exactly.
And the rest of the template.
So the minimal HTML that itself constitutes the index page. Not the header, not the footer, but just the body of that page. Similarly for lectures. If you visit /lectures, I want to see as before the header. I want to see as before the footer. But then in between those two chunks of HTML, I want to see specifically the view called homepage/lectures. And then a similar story for the lecture method. But notice the one interesting difference about the lecture method is that it takes an argument. And when I kept saying /foo/bar/baz before, $n represents which of those variables? So baz, right? The very last thing, in this case, in the URL. And it will be automatically passed in by CodeIgniter to this method. And then notice the interesting feature here is that my view in advance is not going to know what lecture I want. It would be kind of bad design if I had 13 or so different lecture pages that were all manually hard-coded. Much better if I can have one and pass in dynamically an argument like n so that it can parameterize itself and display content for that particular lecture. So now notice these paths, template/header, homepage/index, template/footer. If I actually get out of my controllers folder and go into views, there are those two subdirectories. Let's go into templates because it's the simplest of them thus far. And there's the header. This is code that we wrote ourselves early on. Notice that I'm echoing a title in two different places. I'm calling HTML special charge just in case we accidentally spit out something dangerous. But where is title defined? Where did that come from? I haven't actually, yeah.
Passed it in an array.
Yeah, so recall in the controller that you can pass in an associative array of variables. And in that associative array, in this case, was a variable called title. And how is that implemented? Well, if you think back to like version 2 or 3 from last week, you can implement this same idea of templates yourself. PHP has the extract function. So if you call extract on a variable, on an associative array, it explodes that array so that all of the keys become actual variables. Much like title in this view is an actual variable, and there's no mention anymore of the array that was passed in. Footer, meanwhile, just looks like this, completely uninteresting. So lastly, in views, here's the home page folder of views. There's index, there's lecture, there's lectures, and these two are fairly trivial right now. That just has a hard-coded link to lectures, one hard-coded link to section. Lectures, meanwhile, just a hard-coded list of all the lectures we'd had up until that point. And then lastly, lecture, singular, is a little different in that I'm using n this time, but that's it. That's the only difference. Yeah?
So I'm not super familiar with how PHP deals with scopes, but there's no other way to pass in like instance variables from the array. Like you can't extract it in the control and then have those accessible to you.
Correct. You cannot call the extract function on the associative array in the controller method because those variables will be scoped only to that function, not globally outside of it. And the view is effectively out. It's part of it conceptually, but programmatically, it's completely different. It's a separate PHP file. You are accessing that separate PHP file by way of a method that is called, in this case, this load view. So it's in its own separate namespace. So the only way to pass data or variables in is by way of an argument. Otherwise, it won't have access.
And in terms of rendering it different ways, like let's say you want to respond to JSON or something, can you help me out figure that out?
If you want to respond in a different way?
Sorry, like, I mean, one of the things you might want to be doing is you want to be pinging the server for, data back, right? So if you want to respond in, if it's coming from a mobile app or something, respond as a JSON object.
Okay.
How would you, like, never mind.
Okay, well, so I can guess what I think your question is. What you can probably do in this case is you can output code conditionally. So you could say the equivalent of, in pseudocode, if mobile device, then go ahead and do these 3 lines. Right. Otherwise, go ahead and do these other 3 lines, which might reference different views altogether. Alternatively, you could do the trick we talked about last week where you actually move the user to a different domain, like m.example.com, and you just have a different set of files there, but you can still borrow code from both mobile and non-mobile versions. But typically, this is where you could do something like the user agent detection. If this is a mobile device, spit this out, else spit this out.
What, like render as JSON, render like a collection as something, how would you do something like that?
So that's even easier. If what you want to spit out, as in the case of Ajax, which odds are you'll want to use for Project Zero, well then you don't even spit out HTML. Rather, what you can simply do is something like this. If I get the data I want to return to user, you can do something effectively like Json Encode, though there's a code igniter method for this, of the array in which all of my data is stored. And then this stuff goes away.
And does the routing engine automatically send in the format?
No. So you would have to do that. So your Ajax call, where if you're presumably using jQuery, you would somehow send an HTTP parameter that either says, give me back JSON as opposed to HTML, or you would simply have your Ajax query hit a URL whose sole purpose in life is to return JSON and never HTML.
But that would be, it'd have to be like a custom route, right, to do it with the format at the end.
Oh, with the .json convention? Oh, yes, you could do that in a few ways, but one of which would be you could do it in a custom route. Yeah, Lexi.
Yeah. So would you be returning the JSON string or just like echoing it in its own view?
Returning that's a good question actually. If you were he's not there. I'm actually not sure. Well, so if you use the built-in JSON methods, it takes care of that for you. If you simply echo it here, I think bad things will happen. Let me check on that.
Rendering it, right?
What's that?
Because you're not really rendering it if you just do echo.
Well, I mean, what do you mean by rendering?
I guess you're not rendering it its own view like a typical Ajax.
No, no, you wouldn't need a separate view file at all. If you're just returning JSON, you don't need the cruft of HTML or any templates or anything like that. No. Yeah?
You don't have to set an MIME type or anything like that, though?
Set a MIME type? Well, if CodeIgniter would do that for you if you actually use their JSON encoding method as opposed to just doing it yourself. If you did do it yourself, like you might have before a framework like this, yes, then you would say something like, before echoing this, you would say header, content, type, application JSON, or text JavaScript, or similar, so that the browser knows. Most browsers are fairly resilient, but that would be best practice. Yeah?
Is it better style to parse a template or render a view? Do you know?
To parse a template or render a view. How do you distinguish the two?
So CodeIgniter has its own set of, a template class, a parser class, and then rather than using just variables that come out of seemingly thin air, then you have placeholders for them.
Oh, so the advantage there is performance potentially, because things can be cached more effectively. So that's typically the advantage there. And we'll also talk maybe later in the term about JavaScript templates engines that can do something similar for performance, client side. Yeah, and back.
Is there like some standard design practice on how to choose how many controllers a website has? Like if you had like a lecture page, should you make a separate controller for that?
So that's a good question and perfect segue, actually. So there's actually some shortcomings with this design right now. And if I wanted to, for instance, let me transition to the lecture 2 directory for today and go into version 9 and go into application controllers again. This is almost identical. I started by copying and pasting version 8 that we just looked at. So if I wanted to introduce the notion of not just lectures but also labs, the natural next step for me would be to use my existing homepage controller and simply add a labs method and a lab method. And then suppose we had review sessions or sections. Well, you can imagine just adding more and more methods to this particular controller, but things start to get a little messy at that point, right? And conceptually, once we have all these different types of classes which have different types of resources, like labs don't have videos but lectures do have videos, we might want to functionally display the data in a different way. And so at that point, you might very well want to introduce a lectures controller that handles all things related to lectures and a labs controller that does the same for labs. And so that actually, and that'll be version 10 here, would be probably the best design, certainly as things start to scale. So generally, you would come up with a controller for any sort of distinct functionality that you want your application to provide. And maybe it's themed around real-world entities like lectures or sections. Maybe it's themed around data like courses or departments or lists. In the case of Project Zero, it's really up to you to draw those lines. So how was this routing actually happening? Well, let me go into briefly my config directory, and you might recall from lab or from section or from Project Zero if you've started playing around that, actually let me go into routes here, config routes.php. So notice that I actually have, let me go into version 8 so that we don't see too much at once, the application, config. So this is a special file in CodeIgniter that lets you alter the behavior of URLs. And this is how in version 8 and now 9 we were able to map a certain structure of a URL to a specific controller. So this is unfortunately CodeIgniter's own little syntax with parentheses and colons here. But what this says here, first of all, in reverse order, is that the default controller for CodeIgniter for version 8 of my application should be the homepage controller. In other words, if I visit lecture 1 / and that's it, or at least lecture 1 / MVC / 8 /, so the base URL of this application, it should invoke the homepage controller, right? And so that's nice because you can map it to something arbitrary. And for those of you who did attend lab or have played around, what is actually normally the default controller that you see when you just visit / once you've just installed CodeIgniter? Yeah, so it's the welcome.php controller. So all I did was change that. In fact, I renamed welcome to homepage just to give it a little more semantic meaning and mapped it that way. But more interesting is when you do things like this. So this was my way of teaching CodeIgniter that when you see /lectures, you should actually map it to the controller called homepage and specifically the method called lectures, plural. And then lastly up top, if instead CodeIgniter sees a URL of the form lecture / something, anything, go ahead and map that to homepage /lectures $1. And just like in the case of a regular expression, that $1 is referring to whatever any was representing right there. So this is a way of overriding, to be clear, this format here, which is the default. And in fact, this is going to get very messy if now, in answer to your question, I just start copying and pasting my lectures method